Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Chris, I am genuinely excited about this one because yesterday, on June 18th, 2026, the Senate Judiciary Committee did something that almost never happens in Washington anymore, which is agree unanimously on an artificial intelligence bill.
Unanimous is a word I rarely hear attached to anything in Congress these days. So before we get into why everyone agreed, can you tell our listeners exactly what this bill is actually called?
It is called the Nurture Originals, Foster Art, and Keep Entertainment Safe Act, which everyone mercifully shortens to the No Fakes Act. And it would create the first federal property right in your own voice and face.
Okay, that phrase, a property right in your own voice and face, sounds almost philosophical. So walk me through what it actually means in plain, practical terms for an ordinary person who is not a celebrity.
Picture this. Today, if someone clones your voice with artificial intelligence and makes you say something you never said, your legal options are a confusing patchwork of state laws that vary wildly depending on where you happen to live.
Right, and I imagine that patchwork is exactly the problem, because the internet does not respect state borders, and a cloned voice can travel from one coast to the other in a matter of seconds.
Exactly, and that is why this bill matters so much, because it would give every single American one consistent federal right to control computer-generated replicas of their voice and their visual likeness, no matter which state they call home.
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because some people listening might assume this only protects famous musicians and movie stars who already have armies of lawyers to handle these kinds of disputes for them.
That is a fair instinct, but the bill is written to cover everyone. And honestly, the most heartbreaking cases are not celebrities at all. They are ordinary teenagers and private citizens who get targeted by malicious fabricated content.
That reframes the whole thing for me. Because when we say voice and likeness, our minds jump to a fake song. But the darker reality is fabricated images and audio used to harass completely regular people.
Precisely. And the backdrop here is sobering. Because on the very same day as this vote, a federal court in California held an early conference in a class action over fabricated explicit images involving minors.
That is a genuinely disturbing detail, and it underscores that this is not some abstract entertainment industry squabble. So let us talk numbers, because I understand the bill puts real financial teeth behind the new right.
It absolutely does, and the headline figure is striking. Because platforms that host an unauthorized digital replica after being properly notified could face liability of up to $750,000 for each individual work.
$750,000 per work is a number that would make any platform's legal department sit up straight. So this is clearly designed to change behavior, not just to make a symbolic gesture.
That is the whole strategy, because the bill leans on the platforms themselves to act quickly when someone reports a fake, which is the same basic enforcement logic that copyright takedowns have used for decades online.
Before we go further, can you give our listeners a concrete, memorable example of the kind of harm this is responding to? Because abstractions about rights are easy to nod along to, but hard to actually feel.
Of course, just think about the wave of fake songs that went viral, where artificial intelligence cloned famous singers' voices to perform tracks they never recorded, and then multiply that across politicians, teachers, and even your own family members, appearing to say things they would never actually say out loud.
Speaking of copyright, there's another striking feature I want you to explain, because I read that this new right does not simply end when a person dies, which feels genuinely unusual for something so deeply personal.
You read that correctly, and it surprised me too, because the right can extend up to 70 years after a person's death, which deliberately mirrors the long post-mortem term we already use in traditional copyright law.
70 years after death is a long time. So I can already imagine the debate, because supporters will say it protects a family's legacy, while skeptics will worry about estates controlling a dead celebrity's voice forever.
Both reactions are valid, and that tension is exactly why this was negotiated so carefully, because you want to protect grieving families from ghoulish fakes without locking up a public figure's image for several generations.
Let us talk about the politics, because you opened by emphasizing that the vote was unanimous, and in this era, that almost feels like spotting a unicorn. So who actually pushed this across the finish line?
The sponsor list reads like a deliberate bipartisan handshake, with Chris Coons and Marsha Blackburn leading alongside Amy Klobuchar and Tom Tillis, and a long bench of Democrats and Republicans signing on together behind them.
When you see Coons and Blackburn, who sit on genuinely different ends of the political spectrum, putting their names on the very same bill, that tells me the underlying issue cuts cleanly across the usual partisan battle lines that normally paralyze almost everything in Washington.
It really does, because protecting people from having their identity stolen by a machine is one of those rare causes where a progressive from Delaware and a conservative from Tennessee can look at each other and nod.
Now, here's something I did not expect at all, because you mentioned earlier that one of the bill's notable backers is actually an artificial intelligence company, which seems almost counterintuitive on its surface to me.
It does seem counterintuitive, but OpenAI publicly supports the No Fakes Act. And when you think about it, the responsible labs actually want clear rules. Because uncertainty and lawsuits are far worse for their business than guardrails.
That is a sophisticated point, because we often frame these debates as industry versus regulators. But a mature company would rather operate inside bright, predictable lines than gamble on 50 different state courts interpreting fuzzy standards.
Exactly, and it also reflects a strategic reality. Because the entertainment world, the labor unions, and parts of the technology industry have all decided they would rather shape one federal standard than keep fighting endless skirmishes everywhere.
You use the phrase one federal standard, and I want to underline that. Because I understand that right now the individual states have been racing ahead while Washington has been comparatively slow to act here.
That contrast is stark, because by this point in 2026, 47 states have already enacted some kind of law targeting artificial intelligence-generated media, which is an astonishing level of activity at the local level.
47 states is nearly the entire country, so the federal government is in some ways simply catching up to where voters and their state legislators already clearly are, rather than boldly leading the charge here.
That is a perfect way to frame it, because the energy bubbled up from the bottom, and now Congress is trying to harmonize all that scattered momentum into a single coherent national rule that everyone can follow.
Of course, no bill this sweeping ever sails through without serious objections, so let us be fair and honest with our listeners about the criticisms, because I know free speech advocates have real and legitimate concerns here.
They certainly do, and the most thoughtful worry is about the First Amendment. Because a new federal takedown system could accidentally sweep up parody, satire, commentary, and journalism that uses someone's likeness for entirely legitimate reasons.
That is the classic tension in any content rule. Because the same mechanism that removes a malicious fake could be weaponized by someone powerful who simply wants to silence an unflattering but completely protected piece of criticism.
Right, and there is also the practical fear of removal, because platforms facing that $750,000 exposure may decide it is safer to delete anything flagged rather than carefully judge each disputed case.
That over-removal dynamic is something we have already watched play out in copyright for years, where the cheapest move for a nervous platform is to take first and ask questions later, which can chill legitimate expression.
Which is why the drafters included carve-outs meant to protect news, commentary, parody, and biographical works, although critics reasonably point out that carve-outs on paper do not always survive contact with automated enforcement at massive scale.
I'm also curious how this fits into the wider global picture, because Europe has been moving aggressively on artificial intelligence rules. So does the American approach here look fundamentally different from what regulators are doing abroad?
It does look different in one important way, because Europe has leaned heavily toward broad content labeling and disclosure requirements, while this American bill instead hands individuals a private property right that they can personally enforce through the courts themselves.
That distinction between labeling something and actually owning it feels significant. So practically speaking, how would a platform even know that a flagged video is a fabricated replica rather than a genuine recording of the real person involved?
That is the hard operational question, because detection technology is still genuinely imperfect, and the bill ultimately relies on a notice and response process where the burden shifts to the platforms once a credible complaint about a replica actually arrives.
Let us widen the lens once more, because there is a companion bill traveling alongside this one. And I think it addresses a different but equally important part of the entire artificial intelligence pipeline.
Yes, that is the TRAIN Act, and while No Fakes governs the outputs, the fakes themselves, the TRAIN Act targets the inputs, letting creators discover whether their work was actually used to train a given model.
So if you put those two bills side by side, you get a fascinating pincer movement, because one tackles what comes out of these systems and the other tackles what was fed into them in the first place.
That is exactly the architecture, and it reflects a maturing understanding in Congress, because lawmakers are finally grasping that you cannot meaningfully regulate artificial intelligence without looking at both the training data and the generated results together.
I want to step back and ask the bigger question, because we have covered the mechanics, but what does it actually mean culturally for a society to declare that your voice and face are legally yours to control?
It is genuinely profound when you sit with it, Because for the first time, we are formally recognizing that your identity itself, the unique sound and look of you, deserves protection in an age when machines can copy it perfectly, instantly, and at a scale that no human impersonator ever could.
That perfect copying ability is really the heart of it. Because for all of human history, impersonating someone convincingly took rare talent. And now any teenager with a laptop can clone a voice from a few seconds of audio.
That collapse in difficulty is exactly what makes this moment feel urgent, because the technology raced ahead of the law, and bills like this one are essentially society trying to restore a balance that the machines quietly erased.
So for someone listening right now who is not a senator or a celebrity, what is the honest, practical takeaway about how this might actually change their everyday digital life over the next year or two?
The practical takeaway is that you would gain a real, enforceable national right to say no when a machine impersonates you, and the platforms hosting that impersonation would finally have a strong financial reason to actually listen, respond promptly, and take the fabricated content down instead of quietly ignoring your complaint.
And just to keep everyone's expectations grounded, clearing a committee is an important milestone, but it is not the same as becoming law. So what are the realistic next steps on the road ahead from here?
You are right to temper expectations because the bill still needs a full Senate floor vote, then the House, and then the President, and along that path, the free speech debates we discussed will absolutely resurface loudly.
Still, a unanimous committee vote with this much bipartisan and industry backing is about as strong a launch as any bill could realistically hope for. So I would genuinely encourage everyone listening to watch this one very closely over the coming months.
I completely agree, and whatever your view on the fine details, the fact that protecting your own voice and face has become a serious bipartisan priority tells you just how deeply artificial intelligence has reshaped our basic expectations about identity, ownership, and what it even means to be authentically yourself online.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.